Welcome everyone to The Reason We Learn on this Thursday afternoon. I have a great show for you today, very important show. Glad to see everyone who's already here waiting to hear about this topic. I have my guest here, Justine Kreher, and I'm not going to introduce her. I'm going to let her introduce herself. But before I get started with that, if this is your first time to my channel, welcome again. But I would like to let you know that this channel is about all things education. So anything related to the education, primarily of children, K-12, but all the way up through college, young people, young adults. So the topic we're going to talk about today applies there, but especially for minor children. And if you are interested in these topics, I would invite you to subscribe to the channel so you're aware when I make other videos or interview other people. And I also have a locals community where we can talk more one-on-one about these topics. I have 2 Zoom calls a week on Wednesday and Sunday, and my supporters can join in on those and hear more about these topics or share their insight and ask questions, get help with homeschooling or anything you're interested in to do with education. So again, welcome and welcome, Justine. Please introduce yourself and let everyone know why you're here and what you'd like to talk to us about.
Hello, my name is Justine Kreher, and I heard your interview with Benjamin Boyce, and I also heard your interview with parents of trans-identified children and reached out to you for that reason. I am pretty heavily immersed in LGBT identity politics. I am in a same-sex marriage with somebody who I've been with for 24 years. And I'm technically bisexual, but I'm mostly interested in issues, regarding same-sex relationships and human rights. And I fell into the issue of pediatric medical transition about 6 years ago. And when gay, lesbian, and bisexual people were expressing some concerns about what was going on with that, as well as some other issues around gender activism. So I've immersed myself in this. I'm very well informed about the research and the culture around it and some of the sort of externalities and real world examples of how this is all playing out, particularly in LGBT populations.
Great.
I'm also the board member of an organization called Gender Health Query. And I'm just going to be speaking as myself today because there are other board members and we're all mostly in agreement, but I'm just going to be speaking for myself today. But it's called genderhq.org is the URL. So there's a lot of information on that website. There's a lot of citations and peer-reviewed research. Everything on there is pretty well documented. And so I heard your interviews. Your parent accounts are very, very common. And those stories are very common. I've been hearing them really since 2015, since I sort of fell into this. And one of the parents said, more people besides parents need to speak up about what is going on. And I agree with that. And a lot of LGB people are trying, and actually trans-identified people as well. There's definitely a contingent of vocal trans people who are dismayed at some of what is going on with transitioning people at such a young age and some of the identity politics going around the activist movement. So all my criticisms today, some of which are going to be pretty harsh, are not about a group of people or individuals, unless I'm referring to that particular individual. It's about a way of behaving and an ideology. And these ideologies are supported by a lot of people. Some of them are bisexual, like myself. Some of them are trans people that are pushing some of these more extreme behaviors. So this isn't about individuals or trans people. It's about ideology and behavior.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for that. That's helpful. So what should parents know, when you say that you want parents to know that LGBT people are concerned, can you get into some more specifics about what concerns you in terms of the behaviors, for example?
I think yes, I can list the issues that LGBT people have with what is going on with gender identity activism. And before I go into details, I'd sort of like to read a quote by, a gay man, if I can, because I think it's illuminating and about how a lot of us feel as LGB people, and also I would say some dismayed trans people as well, about what has really happened in the last maybe 7 or 8 years, because it's really turned people against each other in ways that are very painful and destructive to our spaces and communities that we need, especially being such tiny minorities. I mean, gay men are maybe at most 2% of the population. There's higher rates of bisexuals. Lesbians are probably right now under 1% of the population. And so when there's a lot of conflict and drama and infighting going on, it has a huge impact on our communities. And pediatric transition has a big impact on our communities because the people most likely to be harmed by it, or the groups, there are others. There's probably heterosexual females too, particularly, but it's really LGB youth that are most at risk. So I'd like to just read this. This is a gay man named Dennis Noel Kavanaugh, and this was on Twitter, so I'm assuming it's okay for me to read this. And this is what he says. And I think it relates not only to gender ideology activism, but some of the sort of more extreme things going on in the queer community in general, and what you would now term queer activism, which isn't really a negative term anymore. It's been adopted. So I'll read this. I want no part of this tainted, crowded rainbow. I don't want to be part of your schemes or secret plans or pylons or complaints or hanging up on charities or silencing women or telling lesbians to sleep with men or vice versa. I won't celebrate your corporate approval, your secret meetings with government officials, your petulant acts comparing people who dare disagree with you to Nazis. I want no part of your cushy jobs or pet newspapers or networks who speak for you. I don't want to be a part of a movement that says asexual is a thing or teaches children to care about external gender presentations that would be old-fashioned in the 60s. I reject your bourgeoisie obsession with pronouns and looking for offense where there is none. Your silly, pointless campaigns. Spare me your lies and clever word games where you pretend conversion therapy means the same thing as asking a child to think twice before they are surgically or chemically altered and sterilized. Spare me your clever schemes of changing language because you cannot change minds. Do not count me among your troops while you harass decent women out of jobs, while you castigate gay men who created your organizations, while you draw your forces against the one charity that represents us. Count me not in your bovine troops. I'm not part of your narrow prescription that teaches children their bodies are wrong instead of teaching them a society that does not accept them as wrong. I'm not part of your drive to silence and no platform and deny people a voice. I do not fear debate. I will not stand shoulder to shoulder with the goals you have created and released. I will not condone pictures of guns on social media, messages about TERFs. I want no part of Drag Queen Story Hour or relentless focus on children. I am gay rights from 10 years ago, before the madness, before gender identity, before you told me I should feel guilty for having a genital preference. I have not moved 1 inch. You have launched yourself across the veil of madness. You who say lesbians must date men, gay men must sleep with women, speech should not be free, vicious attacks are somehow the act of innocent victims. You would have people arrested and sacked for your corporate sway and hollowing out of human experience. You are now grown into a monster, a lunging, uncontrolled, unmeasured, unreasonable Lethian, a thing made of fangs and claws. You're in your death throes, and each day you're lashing out and screams become more desperate. So this is a very extreme quote. And again, this is speaking to these sort of extremities of what is going on. And you asked what LGB people have concerns with, as well as also trans people. And again, this is not about whole groups of people. This is about an activist movement that's happening. So there are concerned about pediatric medical transition because some youth outgrow gender dysphoria. That is a well-established fact in the research. There are concerns about eradicating the concept of biological sex in law. And so that affects things like prisons, other sex segregated spaces like rape crisis centers and school sports. And we've already seen this impacting females and women and girls. So there have been incidences in these spaces. Sports winning positions are being taken over by trans girls, right? So that's a concern. Also, eradicating biological sex in law is now creating confusion, even in medical settings, which is very concerning. And also, it's going to be difficult to track scientific data if people just change their birth certificates, which is really a public record. So if you go to research, say, lesbian mental health issues, and half of the people in there are M to Fs who identify as lesbians, then that violates my right to track what is going on among same-sex attracted females, which is a topic that I'm very interested in. So this is all pretty intense what's going on, and unfortunate, and I believe unnecessary. But there's definitely strong feelings, as I think that quote sort of exemplified. And also, there is definitely an effort, I think, or at least just an avoidance of discussing the actual harm that can come from transitioning so many minors and even young adults.
Right,
so
right.
Yeah.
And going back to the beginning, now I have a little bit of an echo. Is it still there?
You sound fine.
I do. I can hear echo on your side. I don't know. Can anyone hear it? Oh, now it's gone. Okay. So the question I have is, parents are seeing things right now going back to school. As young as kindergarten, children are being asked to state their pronouns. They're being asked to choose pronouns and tell their teacher what they are. And these are kids who have not learned grammar. They don't know what a pronoun is. So they first have to have somebody explain to them, what do you want me to call you when I'm not calling your name? So they have to have the whole explanation of it. And as a former classroom teacher and somebody who was certified back in the dark ages, this is strange to me. And since I'm not in the classroom now, I don't know what the teacher's been taught about it, but I can't envision how that went as far as the justification for doing it. So in other words, what I can understand teaching teachers, hey, if a student comes to you at some point and says, in other words, if a student initiates something or a parent of a student initiates something, you need to be respectful of what you're told, and you need to be, defer to the parent, and, kind of that's their child, and, we'll try to make accommodations. And, I'm trying to think as a compassionate person and as a person who also respects parents' rights. That's not really my business. It's kind of like how I would treat it. And I would want to make sure that the classmates of that student and the other people in the school, the other adults in the school, would likewise respect that and just do what we have to do to make that child comfortable, right? Like you would with any child, with any concern they bring to you. But somewhere along the line, it feels like it's shifted to be proactive, going to all the children and none of the parents and saying, let's get this up front, and like, hey, let's get all the pronouns, let's get everything up front, when at no time was I under the impression that this was anything other than a very, very tiny, tiny, tiny minority within a minority within a minority, So in other words, right. And so that, now I wonder, how confusing is that for a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old to be asked a question? First of all, it doesn't really make any sense in their understanding of English. It poses a question to them that is like, mom and dad might not have told you something accurate, that like these past 6 years they referred to you as girl or boy or whatever, and here's your name, and now we're asking you, a 6-year-old, to make a decision that contradicts your parents potentially. Right. And yes. So now you put parents in a position that they were never in before, where they have to have a conversation with their kindergartner, like, hi, you were just home playing with your dolls or your trucks. And, when you go to school, they're going to ask you a question. And I mean, it's work now to anticipate what an adult in the care of your child is going to do that might violate the parent-child relationship, the child's emotional boundaries, because that is an emotional boundary of like who I think I am when I'm 6
Right.
is kind of my business. It's like it's not for other people to tell you that, even your own parents. And that was, I thought, part of the whole movement way back in the way back was to educate parents that, you shouldn't tell your children, like, you shouldn't be like, no, you're this, like, you should just be, that's your child, love your child, whoever they are, right? Well, now I feel like parents have to do that. They have to say, this is who you are, and don't listen to teacher, or a teacher might ask you this, and it just creates to me so many um like questions that don't need to be there in the minds of young children who have enough to deal with going from home to school. And then just every year it's going to be the same thing, like more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. And what do you think about that? Like, how is that kind of what you're concerned about? Because that's what we as parents are concerned about is.
Yeah. I would say the main concerns are some of the things that I've already listed. I think that the concerns are the early medicalization
Okay.
of these young people once they identify as trans. I think that the concerns also, particularly in the LGB populations that are concerned about this, is the gender and sexual confusion that we see youth experiencing now,
Mm-hmm.
who are actually coming into our communities very, very emotionally dysregulated and very entitled and very angry and confused at things like, why doesn't a gay man want to date a gender dysphoric female person? That type of thing. So it's not as if these are value neutral lessons that they're teaching, or value neutral information. It's being done in the name of inclusivity, but we're seeing negative side effects from it that are pretty real and very well documented at this point. So I just want to say that I don't recommend, rejecting any child or policing their gender nonconforming behavior. I don't even really like that word, but when you see it, it's kind of obvious what it is. I don't advocate that, but the programs and the way the information is being explained in schools, I can say for a fact is definitely doing harm. Uh, Maybe some children are being helped to not be picked on and to feel more comfortable. And I support that concept, but there's definitely negative things that, I can point to. And the gender and sexual confusion is a big one. And increasing regret rates, I think, in particularly young adults, some of whom transition as teenagers, is another concern.
Mm-hmm.
Why just bringing in these gender trainings that say gender is a spectrum and you can just pick your biological sex it has sides to it that are actually dangerous and having some negative side effects.
Interesting. So can you
Yeah.
give us an example of a side effect for, of something like that? Like telling them there are all these choices and pick
Uh-huh.
one kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that this so I'll step back from the research a little bit and just say from my personal observation. So I'm Gen X, right? I'm 53, sorry, 52, I'm going to be 53 soon. And, I came out, I guess, in my early 20s. And so I've sort of seen the dynamics within the LGBT populations at, school, university groups and support groups and bars and things like that. And I would just say anecdotally, I think young people are more self-absorbed and like emotionally sort of dysregulated and angry than ever before, which is odd considering there's never been more acceptance. And I can actually point to some research, particularly on non-binary identities, that sort of validate greater mental health problems in that population, even above like binary trans man identified and trans woman identified people. So I think that introducing people like that to this kind of information is possibly making their mental states worse.
Interesting.
And it's certainly not being shown in a lot of the research that they just come out and everything's great. So
I see. So it's not like the even some of the, let's say, TikToks or videos that we see where they seem to be saying how, proud they are of who they are, and like explaining, doing these little sort of explainer videos about the many different genders and what they mean and so forth. But I've watched them, and I can't shake the feeling that it's like they're explaining so much because they feel the opposite of what they're saying they feel. That doesn't strike me as the way people behave who are truly comfortable with what's going on. And
Right.
I don't know that, and I'm not a professional, but I don't it's just a gut read, I guess.
Mhm.
It's kind of how I feel.
Yeah, it seems like a good idea to just bring in maybe gender tolerance training programs, and it seems like it's going to be inclusive. It's going to keep the gender nonconforming children safe. And I understand why people think that it's a good idea. I probably would have thought it was a good idea 6 years ago. You actually have to delve into and peel back the layers of how a lot of this is actually playing out to understand it. But I thought I could sort of go through discussing some of that in a certain order that I think is
Yeah,
logical.
please, that'd be great.
So the reason why a lot of LGBT people, and I can't speak for all LGBT people, there's not really like a some kind of like mythical LGBT person. Like that's not really a thing, even though it's promoted in the media all the time. That has this one opinion. So I'm speaking for myself. And I think I reflect the concerns of a lot of other LGBT people and even some trans people as well. But yeah, there isn't such a thing as an LGBT person as like some kind of mythical you know griffin creature with
Yeah.
I don't know, the non-binary glasses and a drag wig and a flannel shirt. That's not a thing.
Well,
So
I also noticed you said LGB, and
yeah,
there's somebody in the comments that said, I like this already. In other words,
yeah.
separating out. And why is that important? Explain to us why that is important.
Yeah, sexual orientation is very different than medicalized gender identity as issues. I was fully supportive of having T added on to LGB. And it was really gay men and lesbians movement at first, and bisexuals got involved with that because they were there, helping it with the marches and some of the activism. And I actually think all of these populations are different. Like there's kind of a statement among unhappy homosexual and bisexual people have dropped the T. I actually think we should drop the LGBT. I think we should drop it all. Gay men's issues are very different than lesbians' issues. Now that we have same sex marriage, I think in the United States, I think that's kind of the mic drop. And so that was something they could work together on. But the dynamics in the communities are different. There's things that they can come together. With bisexuality, they have their own issues. There's always been tension between bisexual and homosexual people. Most bisexuals, really a huge majority, are in opposite sex relationships. I think the last poll, I think it was a Gallup poll, and also there was a Pew poll, showed very low rates of bisexuals in long-term homosexual relationships. So that's just different. And that's they're still bisexual, even if you marry an opposite sex partner, but that's still its own conversation and needs around that gay men and lesbians aren't that interested in that, right? With the trans stuff, you're talking about access to hormones and surgery and minors accessing this. You're talking about replacing gender identity in law that impacts, as I said, scientific data collection and prison and rape crisis shelters and sports.
Right.
These things are so far beyond anything that homosexual and bisexual people were asking for that I now realize that was a huge mistake, even though I was like, yeah, all of us freaks should hang out together and wave our freak flag high. I very much had that attitude, and I don't anymore. These are very, very different issues. And even like bisexual women, they need sort of more resources, and they're not really getting it because LGBT organizations are mostly pushing trans agenda stuff, and they're getting lots of money from a lot of AstroTurf money from these huge foundations. And there's not a lot of gay and lesbian people writing checks to the HRC. They're getting tons of money and being sort of paid to push this. So
Well, that brings up a
safety is
question.
very important.
That brings up a question I have about youth. You know, kids who um may not know what to call themselves, but they really are technically gay. Like they're technically, what I know you call it, pre-gay, or they're gay, and they might, the help and support they might need is to be comfortable with that. And are they getting that support, or are they getting encouraged? Let's say if, for example, their outward expression of gender looks different than, so you might have a fairly masculine female or fairly feminine male, right? Young person.
Yes.
And they may be gay. Okay. But I mean, I'm just spitballing here. But if they present for counseling or help, or, with trying to figure all these things out, these issues out, are they getting that help and support or are they being directed that they should follow the way they look, or there's some kind of stereotypical
Yeah,
towards being
the
trans?
current sort of cultural obsession with gender is definitely affecting all LGB youth, that it's highly unlikely they would have identified as any kind of trans, like even just 20 years ago. So yes, they are immersed in that and they're surrounded by it. It particularly affects lesbian youth. And the lesbian community is something that really had any power or spaces or bars to go to is pretty much imploded. And some of that is just assimilation. And then a lot of lesbians have transitioned, and I can't argue with their adult decisions, and I'm not going to. And I think the rest of us kind of retired to get married, often to the suburbs, to forget about them. And if there are any lesbians listening to this, or maybe bisexual women like me that prefer women and are in same-sex marriages, to start to care about lesbian youth and bisexual youth, because we've kind of abandoned them to some ideological ideas that I think are coming from some of the most unwell people, people that are kind of the most unwell, emotionally dysregulated, sort of self-absorbed kind of people in the community. And I'm not just talking about being a gender dysphoric person. I'm just talking about this ideology that is going along with the activism. Mm-hmm. So yes, young people are being affected by it, particularly females. And they're mostly identifying as queer. In some ways, I'm okay with that, because bisexuality, frankly, is a lot more common than homosexuality in females. And that always creates this kind of instability. Like, you don't really know what someone's sexual orientation is, even if they tell you that they're a lesbian, because it might be different in 10 years. That is a thing. And that makes it really difficult for solidly Kinsey sixes, if you want to use that terminology. It makes it harder for them when a lot of people identify as lesbians and then they're really not. So I'm not opposed to the term queer necessarily, which is often used, particularly for young women figuring themselves out. But yes, there's very few young females even using the term lesbian.
Interesting.
But I thought maybe just I could go through this sort of what I said I think is a logical progression to lay out what the concerns are. And I think the best thing to talk about is the medical side effects. I think everybody needs to understand just how intense the medical side effects actually are before we talk about anything else, because I think having that underlie everything else and the understanding of it is pretty critical. So I just want to talk about the fact that, again, I don't, just kind of a disclaimer, I don't advocate anybody rejecting their dysphoric child. There is research that shows that there are children who are going to be cross-sex identified from a young age who will transition to adulthood. That is a thing. It would be really nice to have everybody love themselves and not have to get any surgeries for anybody, really. But that's just obviously not how some people's minds operate. And they are going to transition. So, that's a thing, and that's going to happen. There's research that it's not good for anybody to really be disconnected from their family. So I was really heartened to see how much your parents seem to love their kids who you talk to and wanted to maintain that connection and relationship with them. I think that's really critical, even if they're having disagreements. So, and I know other mothers who did that. And it actually, worked out well in some of those cases. So let's talk about the medical side effects. So children are medically transitioning as young as 8 or 9 years old. There's at least, I think, one example of showing that females have been put on hormone blockers right at the beginning of puberty. Okay, so that could be 8 or 9 for girls. It could be 10 or 11 for boys. And so there's a good quote I have here from Paul McHugh. I get the sense he's probably a more conservative, probably Christian doctor. He was at Johns Hopkins, and I believe he was involved in transitioning adults until he decided he didn't really think that it was helping them enough to justify the extremity of it. And I would say the research on that is mixed. Actually, there's pro and con studies. We could go into that if you want. But I want to read what he says about puberty, because they are completely subverting a natural puberty, probably in thousands of minors right now, given that there's hundreds of gender clinics opening up. And if there aren't quite hundreds of clinics, just GPs are starting to prescribe this stuff. So yeah, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there are probably thousands of minors on hormone blockers currently. So this is called Virtue Online. It looks like it's an Anglican blog. It's really concerning to me when right-wing Christians care more about pre-gay and lesbian youth than LGBT media and organizations. I find that very disturbing, because this is what the HRC and even the National Center for Lesbian Rights will not talk about. So puberty, okay, that's what he says about puberty. In other animals, all that they shall be is in place of puberty. For us, puberty amounts to a kind of second birth. It is the start of our becoming contributing members to our times. To block puberty and then artificially redirect its course is to tamper with vital human developmental matter with no reason for confidence in what will emerge beyond lifetime preoccupied with medical surgical interventions to maintain the illusion that one's sex has changed. It was with this crucial feature of human beings in mind that the UK court ruled that no child is capable of consenting in these treatments. So that's the Bell versus Tavistock case, where they're ruling back giving puberty blockers to minors. Mm-hmm. So puberty development is pretty critical. He goes through in that article lots of processes that happen with the whole limbic system, the way gray matter is formed, just everything that happens in your brain. So this is all, giving children hormone blockers as young as 9 years old is all being described as fully reversible, which is a completely unsubstantiated claim. So what the hormone blockers do is if the youth goes on to cross-sex hormones, it likely sterilizes pretty much all of them. And it's interesting, the sterilization is an issue because there were some trans rights activists in Sweden who sued the government because they were made sterile, infertile, because they were required to get, certain removal of certain organs when they transitioned as adults. So obviously to adults, having children is important enough to create a lawsuit over it. So now we're putting thousands of children on Lupron and other hormone blockers that are going to sterilize them. Every story you see about F to M seems to be about pregnant ones. So obviously, there's also a study or two, maybe even, about how many trans people want children. So it's not as if the sterilization issue is completely irrelevant, but it's definitely waved away as a concern by people like Diane Ehrensaft, who I would say is the guru of the affirmative model. The affirmative model is pretty much don't question the child and affirm them socially and medically. So we have sterilization. Here's another thing that happens. The complete ruination of sexual function, probably forever. And in a male child that wants to be a girl. So if you put a male child, an effeminate male child who's dysphoric on hormone blockers, it stunts genital growth. So what happens then when they go on to estrogen, that I believe it all gets solidified. I don't think you could just take testosterone later and have everything go back to normal, but I'm not exactly sure about that. But when they go on estrogen, they're sort of solidified in this state of having a child's genitals. So what happens then is they have no sexual function. They probably have no arousal. They'll probably never really be able to experience a fully realized, like, adult passionate relationship because of that. And it also necessitates a much more experimental bottom surgery. It's also odd that this is considered ethical, given that adult MTFs in the past, many have chosen never to even get bottom surgery. So unless they want the genitals of an 11-year-old child, they're going to have to get bottom surgery now. What they have to do is a rectosigmoid vaginoplasty. And I would like to state that they are doing surgeries on minors, mastectomies on 12-year-olds, and they're doing vaginoplasties. I know 17, maybe 16 vaginoplasties. So this is all being done on minors, right? So, or they take the peritoneal lining. I have difficulty with that word. It's like a lining that is around the stomach. They'll use that. They'll take grafts, skin grafts from the inner thighs, and they have to construct this canal. That's much more difficult than if they had let the child mature. Okay, so one of the reasons I want to talk about these medical side effects is that there are reasons to argue for even the true trans child, if you believe in such a thing, to wait, right? Okay, so that's pretty extreme. So in Western society now, we are normalizing severe medical disfigurement of functioning sex organs on minors before they have had their first crush. So, there's more I have to say about the medical side effects. Is this okay? Is this too much detail, or?
No, I think people need to know.
Okay.
Certainly I didn't know, and probably a lot of the audience did not know about the sexual side effects, the sexual dysfunction that would come from this, and that kind of almost forces the bottom surgery. I don't think, and I'll be honest, I'm just going to be very upfront. I think a lot of us don't know because deep down we didn't want to know. There's certain things that if you haven't come face to face with it, you would rather just remain ignorant, if that makes sense. Especially if you're a person who says, look, I love all people. I accept all people. I'm never going to hate someone for who they are. So I really don't need to know the details. And then of course, when it starts going into children, and it could be your child, then you start to want to know the detail. You start to want to know more, but it's hard. It's hard information. And for me, I care about all children. So I'm thinking about other people's kids now, and it's upsetting. It's definitely upsetting, but it's valuable information. So thank you for sharing this with us.
Yeah. There was a celebrity trans identified child who was put on television, who all of this was filmed, including like a celebration with like a cake cutting. And so this 17-year-old underwent one of these experimental vaginoplasties, which then commenced to fall apart completely and required 3 additional corrective surgeries. So that young person will never have any kind of normal sex life. Now, I think there are adults who are very dysphoric about their bodies, and that's just going to be an issue for them anyway. But I would argue that an 11-year-old cannot make that choice, given they haven't had really any romantic experiences or even really crushes or figured out, a lot of that stuff. So for cosmetic results, this is what we're doing to minors. And I think as a society, we're sending a message to them that having a pretty girly doll face, and these effeminate male children want that. They're very into makeup and pink, and they want that. They want to be pretty. But we're sending them the message that, having a pretty face is more important than you maybe wanting children later, or your sexual function. And then these other things that I'd like to talk about, which is the fact that there are about 20,000 adverse side effect reports to the FDA just regarding Lupron alone, which is one of the main hormone blockers used. This is a drug that's used to chemically castrate sex offenders. It's also used to prevent precocious puberty. There are some girls that might start puberty at age 6 or 7, and there's health effects from that. Same thing with boy children. It's rarer, but so there are reasons to do that where the downsides of those early puberties have serious effects, but it hasn't been studied for a long time for this purpose. And these are healthy bodies. They're doing this. This is for psychological issues. So some of the effects of Lupron here are, as with many drugs, side effects have long been a problem. More than 200,000 adverse event reports have been filed with the FDA in the last decade. Women have reported to the FDA hundreds of cases of insomnia, depression, joint pain, and more than 100 cases of blurred vision. About 900 reports cite side effects that children below age 13 have suffered, mostly within months of taking Lupron. Those reports frequently note injection site pain, but also include dozens of cases of bone problems, such as pain or disorders, and the inability to walk. So that's some information about Lupron. This is the drug described as reversible, even on the UCSF website, by the Washington Post, really by any sort of mainstream media or liberal-leaning media, and even medical association information. I find that very concerning.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
So generally speaking, the justification for most medical treatments or medical solutions to a problem is that they will help. So in other words, I guess what I'm asking is, what is the help allegedly offered by medicalizing treatment for gender dysphoria? What's the argument that is being made that it's helpful?
Yeah,
that sounds like a whole lot of not helpful.
Yeah. I think that was that it's good to address this, because I wanted to actually start this off kind of steelmanning their arguments, because I think that that's important to do, because it just seems like, whoa, this is so crazy. Why would anybody do that? So the reason why this is happening is that there are some initial studies regarding early transitions of youth that show, pretty good mental health results. And it's the Steensma studies from the Dutch. It's called the Dutch protocol, because they're the first clinics that started doing this. And so they did a job of like screening out for mental health, more persistent youth for medical transition. And they found that, most seem to be, functioning well and happy with that. What people don't like to talk about in that study, though, is that also part of that cohort also chose not to transition. And that's what people don't like to talk about, because it gets in the way, right? There's a study by the Trans Youth Project. Christina Olsen is the head researcher on that. And it's socially transitioned children appear to be doing well. I think that these are probably, I think they were taken from maybe internet recruitment, maybe other groups, but it's probably, I'm guessing, probably pretty progressive parents. This is just a guess, I don't know for sure, who are probably maybe more likely to be upper middle class. And I could see children like that being affirmed as, being happier with that situation. It's not really comparable to all of the kids in foster care and adopted kids that have all these troubled home lives that actually are very overrepresented in gender clinics. So, it's an interesting study and relevant. There's something called the Cornell Review that reviews lots of studies, and most of these studies are not good studies. They're all very imperfect, but most of the studies showed very low regret rates in adults, and I think that the official regret rates were likely pretty low in adult populations. And there's something called the Pulse survey that shows, young people who've had falling out with their parents are much more likely to have suicide ideation. Again, it's just the way they recruited for the study is not really perfect. It doesn't really have a good control group, but it does show that information. That information is all there. And these are the studies that they will point to justify this. They are terrorizing people with fears of suicide. Okay, that's a whole other conversation. I could talk to you for 3 hours just about the data on that. I would say it's the idea that youths are highly likely to, kill themselves if they wait is definitely used to manipulate and cajole the public. And information on that is mixed. Okay. And by mixed, I mean, I'm talking even post transition. So, but that's what's used. There are high suicide ideation rates. The studies aren't very good, but everyone is using suicide to sort of push this agenda. And those claims need to be treated with skepticism, and they're also reported in a way that violate every suicide prevention organization's guidelines. So, but that's another conversation. So that was kind of long, I'm sorry, but you asked why. I would say some positive studies they can in fact point to, and terrorizing people about suicide.
Okay.
How,
well, I mean, as a
figure the sex organs of a child that hasn't even dated yet.
Right. I mean, that's what my first question as a parent would be along the lines of, obviously, I don't want my child to commit suicide, but what, does it necessarily follow then that there have to be permanent changes made to address, like you were pointing out, can you affirm without medicalizing it? Can you work on being comfortable in your body and comfortable with yourself in other respects and take this more slowly? It was my understanding years ago that there was actually a protocol where people going through transition were, I don't want to say required, but it was highly recommended to even live as the opposite sex for a certain amount of time in every outward cosmetic way before you proceeded with medicalization of your transition. That's what I thought. But I don't know if that's just completely gone by the wayside or not.
Yes, it's gone by the wayside. Particularly in the United States. I have multiple parents who've contacted me with very, very mentally disturbed teenagers being fully affirmed on their first appointment with testosterone being recommended right away. And in some of these cases, the young people wound up desisting, which is the term for sort of the remittance of the GD or desire to transition. So I believe that one of your parents, the father, was the father of desisters. One thing that greatly concerns me is how many young people have desisted who had therapists that were quite enthusiastic, even mirthful about transitioning these young people, who often tried to even drive wedges in between the parents and the youth. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I understand the motivation to do that because there's some parents that are not nice parents. Like, I don't want to discount that isn't a reality, especially being a same-sex attracted person. I've heard a lot of horror stories about homophobic parents. So I know that that's an issue, and that's probably what's motivating the therapist to do that. But this is a whole other conversation. But what should be done with a therapist that fully affirms someone's child who outgrows it? I can't really speak to legal issues, but that person has made a very, very serious mistake. And there's no accountability, even though I have a long list of stories like that. And other people do too. And I'm wondering where the accountability for the therapists are going to be. Or is it going to be like with the satanic panic and the sort of recovered memory syndrome, where this whole trail of damage was left and pretty much nobody was held accountable, with the exception of maybe a few lawsuits with many therapists that push that. So,
well, it seems to be going the other direction, where I've heard of doctors, pediatricians, and others feeling the heat if they don't recommend, like that there's legislation in some places. I know for teachers are feeling pressured. I've just got a letter from somebody yesterday who was told to begin affirming a couple of kids and keeping it secret from their parents and guardians, even going so far as to say, move this child from one part of this particular class to another, where the tenor of the voice is, the music class, the tenor of the voice is essential to doing what they do in the class, and purely on the basis of identification. It's like, yeah, but the voice isn't the voice, this is how it works, and feeling like you're going to lose your job if you don't do what you're told. So I think it's almost like the accountability is going either way. Like, we're going to hold you accountable as you did a bad thing if you don't follow this. Parents too.
We can talk about the how politicized this is, and just how extensive the censorship is, and just how extensive the social punishment for not going along with it is. But I just want to say a couple more things
Sure.
about just sort of the side effects. I also want to say, as far as sort of steel manning, why this is being done, some of the people who transition are extremely motivated to do so. And they become extremely angry when roadblocks get put up in front of them. And that is what is driving this. And it'd be nice, again, to just have everybody be happy with their bodies, but this is just a reality in this population. So any attempts to come between people and the surgeries and hormones that they want is met with ire. And there's a very well organized, very well funded activist movement behind those individuals that have infiltrated major institutions, very well funded LGBT organizations, now Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, the Democratic Party. So a couple more things about the medical side effects, and then we can move on. I think that there's probably IQ effects that needs to be studied more, but there's some information that if you give a developing brain hormone blockers, then it might affect IQ points. There's a case study where I believe there was a 9-point drop. That would be significant. There's some experiment on sheep and their spatial reasoning skills. Like, that definitely needs more effort. And I go back to that that quote that I read about puberty being so essential. So there are a lot of reasons why maybe a child that's definitely certain to transition should wait. I'm not saying ban medical transition, or I'm not going to just make that call right here on the show. I have my feelings about it, but there are trans people that think that minors should wait. And it's all of these, it's sexual health, it's fertility, it's brain development. FTMs, when they take a lot of testosterone, they usually wind up passing fairly well, to the untrained eye anyway, with getting beards and all of that. So having this rush to do it at age 12 and sacrifice possibly your bone health, I think that definitely needs to be reconsidered.
I would think too, like cancer and other things. I mean, when you talk about
health risks, heart attack,
estrogen replacement, I won't even do. And I'm in my 50s. No, thanks. I'm not touching it.
Yeah, that's decisions adults can make. Right. It becomes an issue with children. It becomes a societal conversation. It also is relevant to the gay and lesbian community because the sisters are likely to be gay or lesbian. And then who's going to pay for it? So a lot of people are like, mind your own business, let me transition. But when you're starting to demand that Medicaid pay for double mastectomies on teenagers, it becomes a societal conversation because we can't even cover, like, I believe that people of color are more likely to have their babies die. I mean, there's very serious things. I had a relative who died of type 1 diabetes and she couldn't get all of her needs covered. So I don't want to be up in adults' businesses either, but when this becomes demands for insurance and public funding and not just like a plastic surgery procedure anybody else would have to pay for, it's a societal conversation. So, that's just the medical side effects. I know I spent a lot of time on that. I'm sorry if you didn't want
everybody at all the audience is very grateful. So far, I'm just checking the comments and everybody is wanting this. They want to know.
Yeah. I think everything else is irrelevant until people understand what the actual medical side effects are. So that's why I wanted to go into that. So when you have a gender training come into a school, and you know that as soon as the child declares a trans identification, that parents are going to, like teachers are going to surround that child and the school counselor and drive a wedge between the parent and the child. And then, the next step is the Lupron prescription. Of course, people are worried. I mean, it's not a small, insignificant concern. Right.
It's not just like a small group of right-wing parents who are homophobes or something. This is these are
liberal
parents.
Women and gay, lesbian, and bisexual people are the people who are most concerned about all of this. And I think in a lot of ways, and I appreciate you letting me come on your show to articulate some of that, because I think we articulate a lot of the arguments much better than the right wing does, who's actually more concerned about pre-gay kids right now than the left. To be honest, they really are. But I think sometimes they don't they're not as immersed in the culture and like seeing how it's affecting young people. They don't really have an insider's perspective.
Right.
And then people are very willing to just write them off as bigots, which I don't think all right-wing Christian people are. Some maybe, but
no, all of anybody is anything, right?
Yeah,
exactly. I don't like all or nothing. I don't like words like that. So
yeah, everybody's treating everybody else like an existential threat, and I think it's causing societal harm. But
yeah.
I'd just like to say a quick word about desistance, what the statistics are. And if people are interested in this information, almost all of it is on genderhq.org. There's a list of 17 topics, and there's something called outline up in the outline is up in the navigation bar. And if you go to the outline, there's a very extensive list of topics. And topic number 1 is desistance statistics. So how many kids have been shown to outgrow gender dysphoria?
Is this correct? GenderHQ?
.org. Sorry.
.org. I messed that up.
It's .org.
I got it. Okay.
.org. So the second topic is medical side effects. The other topics are like how old can a person consent, which, a person is not really truly mature until they're about age 25. There's things about the cultural impacts on that website, on the censorship, on things like the cotton ceiling, which are these sort of like sexual demands that are being made of people outside of their orientations, things like that. There's a lot of different topics on there. So the desistance statistics, just real quick, there's a lot of numbers that get thrown out there, and you'll see people say, 98% of kids desisted. And it's hard to say because there were kids that were brought into clinics that were just pre-gay boys that liked pink, right? And I say pre-gay not because I'm ashamed of like being gay, but there's reasons not to talk about sexual orientation in children. So it's just it's not appropriate. So when you see an effeminate boy that loves fairies and pink, you kind of know where that's going, let's face it. But it's still kind of weird to talk about gay kids, right? So I use the term pre-gay, but so they might have just been an effeminate child. The parents are freaking out. I think that was a thing. And trans activists, including the affirmative model gender clinician doctors and psychologists, have really latched onto that, and they've way overplayed that, in my opinion. I think one of the better reviews was sort of done by Ken Zucker of 4 of the more recent studies that have been done on desistance, and he isolated DSM positive kids, and some of them might have been more or less dysphoric than others. I think that like if they're really, really intense, they're probably more likely to be trans. Maybe not less so. They might get a diagnosis, but not quite be that intense. But where that is, no one knows. Is the point? There's no clear line between a pre-gay or lesbian kid and a trans kid. We even know this in the adult community. You can watch Paris is Burning. It's about drag balls. Like some of them get breast implants. Some of them are like, whoa, that's too far, but they're extremely effeminate males and they love drag. Like there's no clear line in children here. We know this. So I think this is really kind of a lie that there's some clear diagnosis between these populations. He came up with an average of 67% desisted with DSM diagnosis. So I think that's a good stat to throw out there. Mm-hmm. It's certain, even if some of those were like not as dysphoric as others, it's still quite a lot. It's still a majority. So this denial of desistance by the media, even medical associations, is highly disturbing. They're downplaying it. They're not talking about it, even though the information is right there in front of your face. And the fact that most of these regretters on like the detransition subreddit are lesbian and bisexual females. So they're same-sex attracted females with regret. So I'd like to mention too, Thailand had to roll back their age of consent because their sort of ladyboy culture, they had too many young gay men transitioning who expressed regret. So we have a case study in Thailand that, yeah, you're going to get regret when you push this like pro-transition culture in youth. Yeah. So anything else about that or?
Well, I guess
I have other things I can talk about the medical associations basically going out of their way to sort of avoid and not talk about these dangers. I can talk about the censorship. I can talk about cultural impacts, but just let you speak because I've been speaking a lot. Thank
No,
you.
I'm riveted. I mean, it's so important. We talked before the broadcast about making sure parents understand that even for all children up to a certain age, a certain amount of cross-gender behavior, cross-gender experimentation with like clothing and makeup and jewelry, and even for some number of weeks or so, is actually normal, and happens in most children, if not all. It's not as strange a thing as you might think, and I think because of the culture and the emphasis on it, newer parents, like with a first child, for example, might immediately jump on something or go seek help or, whatever, when perhaps just waiting it out and just, like, okay, sure, you can wear mommy's jewelry or shoes or makeup or whatever. It's not really going to result in much of anything other than an experiment that they, you know, whatever, give up or move on with. And it's not something to be alarmed by, is I guess my point. And then I would carry that forward even to kindergarten teachers, that you've got 6-year-olds. In most cases, they're 6, and they're still within that range. They're still within a range where, you know, it, telling them this means X is not necessarily helpful. I'm just concerned. I'm concerned about adults telling children who they are. And that goes all the way up to 18, but especially when you're talking about kids who are prepubescent. I feel like it's an invasion of their privacy and an invasion of the parent-child relationship. That's my 2 cents. That's not Justine talking. That's Deb talking. But I didn't know what you thought about that.
Well, there are parent sort of trans Facebook groups, and some of the screen caps from out of there are very disturbing. There are parents that have like 2 and 3 trans identified children. There are parents who seem very, very enthusiastic to label their children as trans. The whole they be, celebrities raising they bees, with no concept of why this is particularly dangerous to pre-gay and lesbian youth, which is why it makes me so angry. So there is a current desire to label any cross-sex gendered behavior as like transgender behavior. And some people are almost a little too excited to do that. And we just kind of know from research about people with like personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder, that sometimes the mental state of the parents too is an issue, or the mental state of the counselor or the teacher. So to pretend that everybody who is enthusiastic about transitioning a child has good motives is a mistake. And that doesn't mean anybody, and I'm definitely not demonizing parents. I think most parents are doing the best they can. And what the clinics say is, you're not going to transition just a child that's playing with gender, even though we obviously see people on social media seeming to want to do that. They say that it's really with the children that are persistently distressed. And they're saying, I am a girl rather than I want to be a girl. And while I think that that's all relevant information, I still think finding that perfect line in an 8-year-old is not possible. So it's more like a gradation, of the child that's really going to be entrenched in that view of themselves, to someone that could have help, someone that just needs to get a boyfriend when they're 16 years old and figure it out, or, or get some therapy, right? There's not really a clear line there. So.
Right. One other thing that I was curious about, if you could, because I'm learning as I go here too. And when we first talked, I learned things like the vocabulary. A lot of parents, they're starting to hear terms like AGP and this and that. And, they're just all kinds of words thrown out, desister, if you could just explain, for example, what is an AGP? People might hear that term or see it on social media. What does that mean?
Yeah, real quick, just on the terms. F to M is a female that wants to be a male. M to F is a male that wants to be a female. And there's also different kinds of gender dysphoria. There's a really good article on a blog. It's more than a blog. It's a really fantastic website called Fourth Wave Now. And the parents on there did very, very thorough research and very much stickler for facts. And they really emphasize protecting same-sex attracted youth, but also really any youth. And the main mother there had Ray Blanchard, I believe, and Michael Bailey, who are experts in gender dysphoria, more on adults. But they wrote an article called Gender Dysphoria is Not One Thing. And if people are confused about what's going on, I recommend reading Gender Dysphoria is Not One Thing from Fourth Wave Now.
Okay.
So they can Google that.
Okay.
And so, before it was mostly same-sex attracted youth who would transition as children, and they were very persistent in their desire to do so and very dysphoric. There's another type that was sort of the main type, and this is what they observed in adults, of M to Fs who are completely attracted to the opposite sex. So they are males attracted to women. So the terminology Ray Blanchard used is autogynephilia, even though this was observed before that. You have very, very effeminate homosexuals. The term for that is HTST, HSTS, homosexual, transsexual. You'll hear that terminology, and you'll hear AGP. These are two different populations of males who transition. And this is a very relevant conversation because there's all other kinds of gender dysphoria now as well. So your parents that had a late onset teen, which would normally be likely to be AGP, I can't even necessarily say that they are AGP right now. So an AGP male wants to be a woman. It's part of their sexual orientation. They're aroused by the idea of being a woman. It's very controversial. You will hear people try to clamp down on discussion about AGP. You'll even hear it from mental health professionals. Anyone who denies AGP is a liar. They're an outright liar. You cannot hide autogynephilia in the age of the internet. And it's the males tend to be pretty masculine. They don't really have the same feminine characteristics. I can't really use the words to describe it here because you're on YouTube. I'm not going to go into exactly how I would define it, but it's a strong desire to love oneself as a woman, which is how it is translated. The issue with this is now you're going to have teenagers like this who are fully sexually attracted to girls going into locker rooms in high schools, because a school has no way to know, is this an effeminate child that has no sexual interest in females? Is this a young teen that might have AGP? Is this teen even on hormones? Are they on hormone blockers? There are definitely some individuals that are like on an erotic, like cross-dressing spectrum, who might also want to transition because they're highly dysphoric, right? It's kind of a gradation between like erotic cross-dressing and a strong desire to medicalize. And some feminists sort of paint this as like a paraphilia, and they'll call people like this perverts. And I don't think that that's helpful dealing with youth, because young males that might have this condition, and a lot of them are really into anime, and they really like the idea of the big breasts, and they want to see themselves as the woman that they desire, is a good way to describe it. Creating all this shame around it is not really going to help teenagers that might have this state. So I think compassion and understanding is necessary, but you can't really provide that proper support where even therapists lie about what it is. It's pretty disgraceful, I think, the way the mental health profession has just aided people in viewing anyone who wants to transition as a pink lady brain damsel in distress. It actually has very unethical consequences for society, particularly with teenage girls in locker rooms and school trips. So I'm not demonizing these individuals, but they're likely to be sexually attracted to females, as any normal heterosexual male, would be. So that's a concern. Mm-hmm. So AGP, homosexual, transsexual, HSTS, the fourth wave now, gender dysphoria is not one thing. There's many more females who want to be gay men. And so now gay men are waking up to having these demands that females, want to be in gay male spaces. But
right.
Sorry, did I say enough on that?
No, that's great. But what it tells me as a parent is that back when the subject first came up of things like, for example, I live in North Carolina, and there was a big discussion here about bathroom law, as you may be aware. Mm-hmm. And right. One of the concerns that parents had, because it would have applied to school locker rooms, school bathrooms, and so forth, is parents were saying, we're concerned about what you just described, okay? That we won't know, and our daughters won't know, and so forth, and the school can't know. And the impression given was that parents who had that concern were ignorant bigots, that, oh, you would think something like that, you're whatever. I mean, people got accused of all kinds of hateful things, and even people, as you described, who were, liberal people, or people who are like, I have no issue, I'm not homophobic, I'm just concerned about my daughter being in a locker room, and there's a biological male, and the arguments were that would never happen. Like, that's not possible. You completely misunderstand this. You're just an ignorant boob. And I always felt like it didn't feel right, didn't sound right to me, meaning like I didn't think they were ignorant. It sounded like a legitimate concern, but it was put down so swiftly that I think people just kind of stopped questioning it, not because they believed what they were told, but because they were afraid to say anything.
Yeah, I have two words for that: evil gaslighting. I mean, I think gaslighting is an overused term, but I could sit here for a very long time with a very long list of sexual boundary violations that have happened in sex segregated spaces by either actual trans identified males or ones who are pretending to be, as if you can really tell the distinction anyway. So that's a lie. So I just want to make it clear, like, I'm a rationalist and I'm a skeptic, and I'm going to talk about facts. And if they are uncomfortable facts about the bisexual population, I will talk about them, and I have. And it makes me not very popular in certain social media spaces. If there's something negative about the gay and lesbian community, I am happy to talk about it. I don't care about sort of people's fears about that. I'm very much like committed to truth. And the truth is, personally, I actually would be pretty comfortable with a homosexual male who's very effeminate, who has transitioned, who wants to be in like the yoga studio space, changing. I'm personally not uncomfortable with that. I don't think that person has any interest in females. They're probably on hormones. They're probably been surgically castrated. But sort of with the heterosexual males who transition, and this is a majority of the MTF population, you just don't know. You don't know who's coming in there. You're talking about a population that is sexually attracted to women. And I'm not demonizing all of these individuals, but it is a fantasy land, living in a fantasy land, to pretend that this is an issue. It's already proven to be an issue in prisons. There's been some assaults in either homeless or rape crisis centers, both, I think. We've seen it in the lesbian community. These individuals coming into the lesbian community, they're extremely sexually entitled. They are extremely graphic in their threats. It's very obvious what gendered behavior they are engaging in. And I think building a whole narrative that is now going to be enforced by, I think, the Democratic Party, if they pass the Equality Act, and all of these school programs, and what the Biden administration is doing, is they are absolutely forcing the public to go along with something that's a lie. And I'm not demonizing all these individuals. I mean, autogynephilia, it's sort of an odd sort of psychosexual state to have. I'm same-sex attracted. That's kind of weird in its own way. People want to hang out because they're different, or LGBT people want to hang out because we're all kind of different and we have things that are going on that are not really normal, which isn't even necessarily bad to be abnormal in all cases. That's fine. That's based on honesty. Some of the best sort of allies against trans activist extremists are open autogynephiles, and they're very articulate and they're great. And any one of them is welcome over to my kegger. That's fine. But when you are instituting lies on the public, and you're gaslighting them, and you're telling them that their concerns are not valid, and you're telling 16-year-old girls that their concerns are not valid, I mean, I'm just going to be blunt. I think it's evil. So I know that's a strong statement, but
well, I just think lying, period, is evil. Like, if you know
It's the
something,
lying. It's the lying. It's
yeah,
not trans people. It's not gender dysphoria. It's activism, and it's sort of lying about things. That's what the issue is. So I also don't recommend this any kind of like demonization around this. I think any young person experiencing this should get help and support and honest information about what they might be experiencing, because it's if a teenager gets interested in cross-dressing or something, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be served by medical transition as a 17-year-old, right? So
right.
honesty, facts, supporting youth, being kind, compassionate, good therapy, that's all I want. I don't want denials of information, denials of risk, denials of what's really going on, that is being fully engaged in by therapists, which I find disturbing. But anyway.
Well, no, I mean, I think, you know, is the thing I think most parents listening are now probably trying to figure out is, because I believe most will agree with you. I know there's most will agree that they just want compassionate care for all children. And, there'll be some parents on the fringe who are just whatever, don't want to hear about any of this, but most just want their kids to get whatever care they individually need, whatever that is. And I think common sense teaches us, whether you're an adult or a child, that you want to think very long and hard before you make permanent decisions to deal with what could potentially be a temporary situation. Um, you know, it is, I think, unhealthy to teach anyone that their emotions are facts. And again, at any age, I think you need to help people think rationally even about their feelings. Let's look at that. Let's look at why you might be feeling this way, what's going on. Let's look at the history. Let's look at what else is going on in your life. So what I'm just seeing is, regardless of who you are, regardless of where you're starting, that the care is not care. It's more like a process or an agenda or a protocol, rather than compassionate care for individuals who are seeking something in their life. And there ought to be people who are there to help them work through it at their individual pace, and to get to the bottom of what's going on with them as an individual, not to join a club, not to put a label on them, not to go through a protocol or that's like checking boxes, not to cover someone's butt legally. All of these things, it just feels like we're not being humane. We're not being truly intelligent and thoughtful about how we're doing this as a society. It almost feels like, let's find the quickest, easiest, most politically expedient way to deal with this problem that people are having. And, maybe there's some money to be made, maybe there's some our backs to be pat, and let's see what we can get out of this, as opposed to, this is challenging and we need to dig in and deal with it. And I feel sometimes like it's a lot of loneliness and I don't know what the right word would be, self-serving kind of. I see a lot of self-service going on. And
Particularly by
that's my
adults.
take.
Yeah,
Yeah,
particularly self-serving behaviors by adults, and they are bringing children into it all. I
right.
mean, there's
No,
legitimate concern about dysphoric children, but there's definitely agenda-driven things going on. Yeah.
so what would you say now, when the parents were on here last week, they had some specific pieces of advice, and it really was directed at parents. What would you say to concerned teachers as well as parents who are facing, this protocol? They're told, this is our policy, this is what you have to do, or the parents are thinking, I'm seeing this happening, or my child is coming to me and saying, I want the testosterone now, or they find out the teacher sent them to the health center and they got it, or whatever. What how can people find the kind of care that you and I are talking about? How can they select people who will really help?
I really wish I had a better answer, because I cannot. I don't have a list of really good therapists I can even send parents that contact, like our gender health query organization. There's very few there's a lot of affirmation going on in the schools and in the mental health profession. This is all pretty much unstudied what the consequences of this are going to be. So it's not really justified how sure everybody is being of themselves. And trying to get pushback on this and get proper care, it is very difficult. The only thing I can do is recommend networking with other parents. I mean, there's GenSpect, right? I believe one of your parents or
Yep.
more are
They
involved in
mentioned
that
it.
organization. I think that there needs to be more communication between concerned LGB and even trans people and parents, kind of more of probably an alliance there just to sort of change some of the culture. Uh, I wish I had more of an answer for you about what to do about the legal implications of having people's children separated from them, about teachers being forced to use words that they don't believe in. I do think this is going to come down to legal battles in the Supreme Court over things like Title IX and compelled speech, and yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have clear answers. There's another organization called Our Duty. I definitely recommend people go to SEGM, SEGM.
Okay.
I would put that in there. They're a group of I think, are they just doctors? They're probably doctors and therapists and academics who are much more skeptical about the safety of transitioning minors. And they appear to be very good at combing through information in very detailed ways to have very fact based arguments.
Okay.
But the whole culture needs to speak up. Like everybody that has questions about this needs to begin to feel more comfortable talking about it. But the problem is it is like a McCarthyist environment. You do risk getting fired, you do risk losing your job. But until people can actually admit that this might be dangerous, which they can't in a school setting, I don't know exactly what to tell you. Um, I do know that I am working on something that is going to move forward to try to organize more with parents, particularly about what is going on in the schools. And I can't go into details about that right now.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
I would look to the UK. The UK has had much better luck of pushing back on some of this stuff, and they've done it because they have a public healthcare system. So the people in their country, they see all these graphs of they're going way up of females going to all these gender clinics and these like explosions in young people coming to clinics. So they're aware of it because they report on it because of their public healthcare system.
Right.
And then they really only have one main. That's now LGBT since about 2014, I guess. Organization Stonewall has been pushing all of this and really abusing anybody that disagrees, and with all of this sort of very intolerant rhetoric and histrionics. And so a lot of gay, lesbian, bisexual people publicly renounced that organization in the UK. Women, I mean, I need to give credit to all the women here too. There are women, particularly lesbians, who back in the 70s realized this was going to be a problem. So I kind of call them the oracles. There's like Sheila Jeffries, there's a lesbian lawyer, a couple of lesbian lawyers who've been involved with this. And I have to give them credit because they're smarter than I am by seeing this was going to be a problem. So yeah, I know I didn't really answer your question. I wish I
Uh,
could give you
that's
more
okay.
details on the legal information.
That's
Yeah,
okay. I mean,
yeah,
it's one more reason why, when I am cautioning parents, when I say they'll say to me, "Well, I can't homeschool because I'm worried about socialization," or um I don't want to pull them out because of this or that. And I think, I mean, obviously there are some people who just can't for economic reasons, whatever. I'd like to believe we could solve those problems, but I still try to say be careful because it's a different world now than when we were kids and we were in school.
yeah,
And, not that things were so great then, but it's just a different world. And at this point, when you drop your child off at the school, even that first day of kindergarten, they might come back to you not the same. Like they may hear things, they may be shown things, they may have concepts introduced to them that will begin to come between you and your child, that you may not be able to back away from. I mean, it's without consequences to you. I don't mean to sound so, scary, but I just think people need to know. Be very sure that you know the school, you know the teachers, you know what they advocate, what they'll stand up for you about, what they won't, and enter into it knowledgeably, as opposed to just finding out after the fact. I didn't know they were going to do that. We found out this week in my own state, a task force has been working for a while, collecting submissions from all over the state about various forms of indoctrination in the schools. And one of the themes was this gender, agenda sort of thing. And there was a book presented to third graders about a fourth grade boy who was talking about being surgically, having surgery. A fourth grade. So the book was about a fourth grader, and it was presented to third graders. And the parents didn't know, of course, till after the fact. And this was in the report that it wasn't even supporting any of the state standards. They couldn't understand how this made it in there, but there it was. And how do you, a kid comes home and starts talking about, somebody was going to, then there's like a scissor motion even in this book, and it's a picture book.
Right.
So, these are the kinds of things that I think you really need to know what's going on in your school and what kind of ideas are being presented.
Yeah, I think to push back on all of this, I don't have so much advice for somebody like in an individual situation. I would turn to maybe contacting GenSpect, and then from there, there's other parent organizations to talk about what they did that worked. So, and definitely to any parents that are going through this who are distressed, please, make friends. Like, please put yourself in a place where you can talk freely, because it's a type of oppression, not being able to just speak your mind around your own friends because you think they're going to turn on you, even though you probably have legitimate concerns, right? So definitely get support. There are plenty of people out there. There's a lot of them on social media, and you're probably put information to Gender Health Query maybe in the show notes, and people can contact me and I can forward some links as to where people can go. But get help, talk to friends. It's really difficult to watch a young person want to do something that's really quite extreme to their bodies and worry about that. But just try to stay positive and keep a positive relationship to your child.
Right.
I think to figure out how do we push back on the overreach that's happening, I would look to what's happened in the UK. And also, there's a big movement now against critical race theory. And there is overlap with this. I would say there's a pretty extreme left-wing sort of Marxist type, also influenced by postmodern ideology, which is a very subjective view of the world, which is why you can say I'm a girl just because I feel like it. So all of these ideologies are coming out of academia, and I would say that it's kind of extreme feminism and extreme queer theory, which the trans stuff falls under, and then there's kind of critical race theory with the racial issues. Right. And they're all addressing reasonable issues, but they have a common theme in them, is in that they're not very academically rigorous, in my opinion, even though they might touch on some certain statistical facts that are true, like people are put in jail when they shouldn't be, or things like that, into sort of more this sort of oppression and identity obsessed worldview that is not very academically rigorous. And instead of having critical race theory in school, it's probably better to maybe do a class on like, how can we look at prison statistics to make sure that certain groups aren't being punished unfairly over other groups? Like, that's the rational scientific approach. Right. The critical race theory approach is going to be like, privilege, white people are privileged, and this, and this. It's like, it's just a whole ideology.
Well, you start with the conclusion and then you work your way.
Yeah. Or you're talking about white privilege and in ways that are just, I mean, it can be a real thing, but just, you probably talk to your listeners about that. But my point is, there's a whole movement to push back against that. Mm-hmm. And because people understand that it's going to backfire. And in the same thing with this gender ideology stuff, they don't understand how it's backfiring and the externalities of the damage that it's doing. So once you start to walk people through educating the public doing that, I think more people will wake up like, oh yeah, we do need to deal with racial issues, but this particular approach is going to actually push people into tribes more and backfire, right? Same thing with the gender stuff, like, oh, this is actually really confusing young people. And so I feel like there's a system being put in place to sort of push back on some of the critical race theory stuff that I'm hoping is going to stay in place to deal with the gender stuff, because they're both not academically rigorous ideologies.
Right. Yeah. No, I think
you don't have the 10 Commandments in schools. You should not be able to go in a school and just say, oh, sex is just a spectrum, right? You should not be allowed to get away with that, in my opinion. You can talk about it, but not unanswered or uncontested, right?
Well, it would be, my point of view is that, saying that something is true because a lot of people believe it, or even a subset of people believe it, like this subjective postmodern kind of idea. You walk in and say, well, a lot of people believe the earth is flat, so let's teach that too. I mean, you don't, just because a lot of people believe something doesn't make it true. That's why we have science. That's why we have research, and that's why there's rigor behind that, to find out that what we're teaching children is evidence-based, and really evidence-based, not evidence by, we got a bunch of people whose lived experience matches this conclusion. There you go. There's our evidence. That's fairly self-serving. You have to be willing to go where the data takes you. And, you don't even have a hypothesis until you start with, like you got to even you don't have the hypothesis till you have a certain preponderance of data, and then you can have a hypothesis, and then you have to test it and all these other things. And we're not even teaching kids about proper scientific methodology, so that when adults come to them and say a study showed, they just take their word for it. Even adults, I'll see studies show, and I'm like, what studies? Like, did you look at the, how rigorous were the studies? So I think I would encourage parents to don't underestimate your own curiosity. So if something doesn't quite sound right, follow that curiosity, and do your level best to look at the study. See if was it peer reviewed? By whom? Were all the peers of one mind? So you can inform yourself, and then you can, I think, challenge some of these ideas, as you've done, by steel manning the argument. So look, I totally understand that we definitely do not want young people to commit suicide. Right with you. Don't want that. We also want young people to accept themselves and be loved and cared for, and, have an inclusive and accepting classroom, society, etc. Yep, right there with you. Is this really the best way to go about that, though? Are we helping, or are we harming? Is the cure worse than the thing that they're looking to get help with? And that's what I'm hearing you say, is that we are going down a path in an extreme manner towards something, and it is hurting too many people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it might be having the effect of, making some youth more comfortable, or they feel more celebrated, or all of these other things. I mean, I'm not saying everything is black and white, but I have a screen cap of the organization Gender Spectrum going into, I believe it was an Oakland school. I'm not sure. I think it was in Oakland. And it's a picture of how, it's from a video. I got it from a video of this whole, about how there's like your body, and then there's your identity, and then there's your sexual orientation, and how masculine and feminine you are. And it's all done as if it's the spectrum. And they had the kids come out and up and put X's where they are. So now you have all these children put, like, who are tomboys, who are now like, yeah, I'm right between a boy and a girl, based on this training. So why is this organization allowed to come into a school to promote an ideology that is absolutely detested, even amongst LGBT people? I mean, there are people, usually the term for them are like trans medicalists. They don't like the non-binary stuff. They don't like the gender spectrum stuff. They see themselves as having a psychological and medical issue, and they don't like that. The lesbian community, like certain lesbians, they hate that because it's causing sort of this narcissistic demands for special pronouns and reinforcing gender stereotypes that we thought we were sort of bucking in the past. And, there's gay men that don't like that. I don't want young people taught that gender is a spectrum, even gender. Certain traits can sort of be defined on maybe as a spectrum between stereotypically masculine and feminine. But I'm telling you, I see the damage that this does in terms of inculcating people into a narcissistic worldview, where particularly maybe if they want like a third gender pronoun, where now everybody else is there to support their ideology, which I believe is like the epitome of first world problem privilege. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we see this attracting people that appear to have personality disorders, and now everybody has to obey them, what they say about their pronouns, which have been shown to maybe change weekly in some youth who are now using this as a power trip. So is this organization talking about any of that when they're coming in and having kids put this X on the board? No, they are not, but we see it every day.
Well, it's also
Yeah.
creepy. I mean, you're talking about minor children. Adults should not be asking them these questions. Like, how does this support their learning? The purpose of school, okay, is not to affirm all of your feelings about yourself. That's not why we send children to school. As
No.
I said, if a child is having difficulty and needs some help, obviously the adults there should be able to try to direct them to the right place to get help, the counselor, their parents, whatever. But the purpose of school is not to, like, let's explore every last little thing that could potentially possibly be going on with you, and to the point where you're asking deeply personal questions and that the kids don't necessarily know they have a right to not answer. They don't they're too young to say, it's none of your business. I'm not telling you that. This, I don't even feel comfortable putting an X on the thing. And now you have social pressure to put your X on the board, right? So now I got to do something to participate in this activity where I am expressing myself in front of my peers in a way that I may or may not be comfortable. So what are you going to do? You're going to look for social cues. You're going to look for, like, what's going to get the most approbation? What can I do here that is going to make me not feel uncomfortable? And if the social pressure is in one direction, how do you know we're not just causing a new kind of trend, like a peer pressure to go, a social contagion, if you will? This is
Well,
public. You're doing this in a classroom. It's kind of, I don't know.
yeah, a lot of us have concerns about just sort of what's going on with the culture around identity politics and also regarding GSAs, because the people that go in and set up these programs and kind of mentor in some of these organizations are sometimes kind of the most extreme people. It wasn't really like that so much when I came out. I had really positive support groups with like older lesbians, and they were very sane and they were very focused on making sure people weren't getting into reckless sexual behavior, or that they were okay, and not getting kicked out of their homes, and just had like emotional support, and all of that was really sort of like healthy. And now a lot of us are becoming kind of suspicious of all this stuff labeled LGBT and their seeming obsession with children. A lot of us are actually finding this like kind of creepy. And so it doesn't, I'm very much for sex education and support for homosexual students on campus not to be bullied, and making sure that trans identified students aren't being harmed. But I no longer believe automatically that any sort of safeguarding concerns are just being promoted by like right-wing Christian bigots.
Right.
And I'll give the drag queen story hour as an example. Like when I first heard about this, I'm like, oh, theatrical gays will go into libraries and read to children. There's nothing wrong with that. They're just going to dress up in like fairy tale costumes or as witches or whatever they're going to do, because drag queens love to do that kind of stuff. I didn't see any problem. I'm like, that's homophobic. Well, then the video clips started to come out of like drag queens twerking in front of the face of like a 6-year-old girl who's sitting in a chair. One of them rolling around on the ground, just like really inappropriate stuff. And it turns out there was definitely pedos that infiltrated some of those groups, including one who is a judge that was caught with child porn, and he's also one of the advocates of Drag Queen Story Hour. So we used to have a lot of like policing in this, in like the gay and lesbian community, where there was like pride. And NAMBLA really tried to attach themselves to the gay rights movement. And, research has shown that pedophiles really like their age group. They're not gay men. They like teenage boys, like tweens or below. Like they have certain age groups. They do not belong in the gay community. They absolutely don't. And so there was sort of that infiltration attempt, and a lot of it was really a lot of the lesbians that really like stood up and said, absolutely not, and gay men too as well. So people will try to sort of infiltrate this happy rainbow and like unicorn. That is a thing. That is a thing that happens. So I don't advocate any kind of like, homophobia, and I'm very proud to be in a same-sex relationship. I'm very happy. I think it's the greatest thing in the world. I love it. I'm very happy. But I don't necessarily trust every person that is involving themselves in educating queer youth or any other youth anymore. And I lack faith in therapists' critical thinking skills. I lack faith in teachers' critical thinking skills. I lack faith in a lot of adults' critical thinking skills around these issues. So if you have parents that feel that way too, if someone just tries to call you a bigot, all I can say is sometimes you have to get in people's face and say, you're not going to tolerate that, which is what I do at this point. Right. But I have less to lose. I'm not really cancelable. So.
And now I'm hearing echo again.
Oh.
Where'd it go? I don't understand why it's like it doesn't happen and then it happens. So anything else? I mean, this has just been so helpful. I think the audience as well probably got a lot out of this. There've been so many comments and everybody is just saying, even with some of the parts that we're fairly detailed, we're like, yes, more, tell us what this all is. And I think because we have not had access to this information, you have to search and search and search, and it's hard to get. So I hope this will remain available.
Don't use Google, try DuckDuckGo, something else. And Twitter is a space where a lot of people are talking about this. I don't recommend anyone being on Twitter, but if you want to find I know there's at least tens of thousands of us as far as LGB people who aren't happy based on other social media spaces that get shut down by trans activists.
Right.
So we get silenced and censored and threatened and abused. And it's like being in an emotionally abusive relationship that we can't leave.
Right.
And it's a problem for us too. And I think more conversations between LGB people and parents. And, I haven't talked about sort of the trans allies a lot. They are out there. I think we're trying to create some spaces that don't necessarily involve that, which is why I've been focusing more on LGB people. But you can find plenty of vocal trans people who have concerns about all of this as well.
Yeah, I've seen some that video I sent you from Gothics.
Yeah,
there were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they tend to be more conservative, not always. But yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours and hours about this stuff. I don't know if you want to wrap it up. It's been a long time, and thank you for this platform.
I so appreciate it. I just was going to ask you if there were any last things, but it sounds like you pretty much said what we could say for today. And then who knows, maybe we'll come back with more.
Sure. I could just point to one more thing. I just want to say one more thing about the full ideological capture of even like the American Academy of Pediatrics, of there's a medical skeptics organization called Science-Based Medicine that they pulled down a positive review of Abigail Schreier's book, and they put up an absolute garbage, error-riddled article of which they completely failed to correct. And this is like a science skeptics organization. Major institutions are captured, academia, the AMA. We as Gender Health Query have to write letters to the Endocrine Society and Pediatric Endocrine Society because their actual public statements are incorrect or they're omitting critical information. And this is all being presented and almost marketed in a way to absolutely deny just how serious the downsides are, even to children. Let's just say you have a 3% regret rate. Do you know how many thousands of young people that's going to be with how many people they're putting on hormone blockers in this country, how they're normalizing it in every school? Even a 3% regret rate. Do you know how many over-medicalized people that is? So I'm sorry, you can't trust the medical establishment. I'm sorry to say that. And my only explanation for it is kind of like how you tell somebody they don't look big in those jeans. You think that you're doing more good than harm by sort of doing that. I think they're protecting what they think is a vulnerable population, and they don't want any discussion of any kids who could get in the way of that narrative that they think that they're really helping. Unfortunately, that means that those young people, and this includes autism spectrum, LGB youth, maybe a kid on like a cross-dressing teenager, or trauma victims, sexual assault victims, are now basically gray area youth who are morally acceptable collateral damage that's what I focus on. If you want to go focus on all the positive, happy, clappy trans stories, they're out there. I don't deny that. Go find it. It's everywhere else. This is a conversation about the downsides. So
yeah, well, I can't thank you enough. It was really informative, and thank you to all in the audience for coming today, for listening, for participating.
and thank
Please
you.
share this information with people who would be interested in it, because as we've discussed, it's not easy to come by. So here you have in one interview, you've got a lot of questions that have been addressed and answered. And I thank you so much, Justine, for spending your time with us today. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
I
you. You're
really
welcome back anytime. Anytime. All right.
appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Bye.